One thing about BDSM relationships is there's incredible amount of disclosure and understanding between the two partners.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
So let's start off with who you are and what your background is.
So I'm a licensed therapist. I have been since either 2018 or 2019. I believe you had me on the show due to the fact that I also counsel and am an active member of the BDSM community. That's I believe why I'm here.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting topic to get into here in a bit. What motivated you to become a therapist?
I wanted to know why people think the way they think and why they act the way they act. And that's pretty much textbook for going into therapy.
That is definitely a motivation of mine as well. When you were in grad school, did you see any kind of like bias, political bias, or trying to influence you one way or another on issues regardless of evidence? Did you see anything like that?
I didn't see it as much in grad school. I did see it in undergrad. I
Mm,
did see a very heavy lean towards the more liberal side, but I believe that's fairly common due to the fact that the field of psychology is predominantly a liberal field.
gotcha. And then since you've been licensed, what have you noticed when you kind of observe the field?
In the way it's changed.
Yeah,
So I see clients. I don't know how familiar you are with the mainline area of Pennsylvania. It's very much a worried well population.
gotcha.
So I do see some people with significant trauma, that is true. But I do also see people that do a lot of navel gazing, if you understand that term. And that's hard. And I think it's gotten harder, especially I definitely saw it during and after COVID when people started soothing the younger generation extensively. So they were no longer allowed to feel those awkward, uncomfortable feelings. You had to leap in and help them and soothe them and take away the bad feelings. And it's led to, I believe, a significant increase in depression and anxiety crops up in gender dysphoria. And that's what I feel is going on. But by all means, I could be incorrect.
No, that's really interesting because I feel like, I think to me, a lot of what's going wrong in therapy is kind of a misuse of empathy or kind of a warped empathy. So it's like, I
Mm.
want to jump in and save my client. I don't want them to feel uncomfortable. But by doing that, you kind of create all these other problems and they fail to develop resilience. Is that kind of what you're
Yes.
saying?
Yes, definitely the lack of resilience, and I see it in my kids' friends. I see it in definitely my younger clients. There very much is, I have a problem here. I'll give it over to you and you can fix it. It's like, no, this is your problem. It sucks. I can be with you during it, but my solution isn't going to be your solution. So you're going to have to hold that anxiety, you're gonna have to hold that uncomfortableness and figure out what to do with it.
I think it was Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff talked about how the mentality of kids is something goes wrong, I need to find an adult. And like Generation Z is holding on to that mentality long into their own adulthood. You see
Mhm.
that?
Yeah. I mean, when I was growing up, so I'm 40, and when I was growing up, there was definitely an emphasis placed on better self-esteem. So even if the people didn't warrant, the example I always use, I used to be a violinist, and the conductor at my school would just allow the second string violinists to go into the first string. I don't know if you know the difference. The first string is the top tier. Like you've worked at, being that. And the chair, the lead chair, she's worked the most. She's the one who leads the first and second string violins with her or him is example. And my the conductor who was at my school, he was just subbing in, second string can now be in first string and string can now be in second string. And when I said, this doesn't make sense, this is wrong, he said, well, how would you feel if you were in second string? And I also was in a highly competitive, it was called Reading Symphony Youth Orchestra, and I like barely squeaked into it. Like I was second string, like right in front of the drums. And I'm like, I did. I am. Because I didn't practice 3-4 hours a day like the people in first string. I did 45 minutes or 30 minutes, and that's why I barely squeaked in.
Feels like this kind of culture where everybody needs a participation trophy, so that
Yes.
we can all kind of feel good about ourselves. Do you feel like that type of mentality where, we don't want to rank people or have winners and losers or kind of make it competitive? Do you feel like that contributes to what we're talking about, like with a lack of resilience?
Yeah, because those people grew up and had kids. And what do you do? What do you do now? You can't be a parent. You can't be a parent and allow your kid to suffer for their own actions. You have to step in because they're feeling uncomfortable, and that has to be wreaking havoc with their self-esteem. So you have to step in and coddle them.
Wow. So I want to get into your practice. You focus on trauma. Is that your
I do.
primary focus?
Yeah. I mean, I would say I have 7 or 8 clients currently that are in the BDSM lifestyle.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that's quite a few. How did they become like attracted to you? How did you?
So the BDSM lifestyle is such a incredibly close-knit community. So first, I advertised on something that's called FetLife, and that's basically the Facebook for kinky people. So I advertised on that, and I got a couple of people. And because I'm also in the lifestyle, they very quickly learned, okay, Deirdre's actually also in the lifestyle, so I don't need to explain these terminologies, or I don't need to explain these power dynamics to her. She already has it. So I could call out, okay, this actually looks like an unhealthy master-slave relationship, whereas other clinicians wouldn't be able to do that. They wouldn't be able to call it what it is.
So what you're telling me is like in kink BDSM, you see healthy and unhealthy manifestations of that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it. Like in my grad program, in my marriage and family counseling class, they said basically all kinks are healthy, all BDSM type stuff is healthy. Like you can never challenge or even kind of dig underneath a client, and it just seems like certain things you would think, gosh, there has to be something behind this. And the one that comes to my mind is like, what if somebody really wants to be like humiliated during sex? Like, is there like it's impossible if there's nothing behind that?
So here's where you really run up to, I believe, several walls. Number one, you're not going to, just in preparation for this, I thought maybe my research is outdated. Maybe there is studies that have further explored BDSM and they actually have started doing good studies. And no, it's still the self-report. We sent out a bunch of, surveys and questionnaires, and, the people reported back, and here are our findings. So that is going to paint a much different picture than, because they're not going to say, yeah, I was sexually abused in my childhood. And then, that led to this. You're going to get, and we both know that self-reporting and surveys and questionnaires, those are wildly
Skewed.
skewed and not consistent with the general public or the general population.
So what do you see? Because you get more behind the veil, really. Like you get to see more raw authenticity than you would get from like a self-report and a survey. So what do you see as a therapist that you feel like these surveys miss?
I didn't get too into the weeds with the surveys. I didn't research the actual questions that they asked. But so you have, and this might be not flagged, but I'm sure if this reaches the BDSM community, I'll probably get some blowback. But I'm considered an old head, in the BDSM community. So there's very much In my view, there's a divergence. So there's the BDSM community and then there's the polyamorous community. So like swingers, and that can mix a little bit. Like you can have people who are into BDSM who also are polyamorous and vice versa. But so that also muddies the waters. The clients never come in because everything's going great
Mm.
with their relationships. I know personally, I know one lifestyle couple, good Lord, I think they've been together 25, 30 years, and they're a rock in the BDSM community, and you know, they're perfectly fine, but they also wouldn't seek therapy. So again, it's hard to measure that
Mm.
because I'm only seeing
Selection
this.
bias.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have as much exposure to like swingers in the polyamorous community?
Yeah, because it bleeds. It bleeds through. Yeah. So you'll show up to kink events and it actually is being hosted by a polyamorous group. So everyone will just start getting naked and you're like, okay, so we're doing this.
Do you have any like observations about the psychology of these type of people that are drawn to those two communities?
So I personally feel that being into BDSM, I believe that that's a sexual orientation, much like
Interesting.
being gay. It's not, you can fight against it. You could probably get married to or be in a long-term relationship with what we would term as vanilla, so people who aren't into BDSM, but it wouldn't fulfill that need. With that being said, mm, there's tiers, especially in the BDSM. So there's the most superficial tier, which is being a top or bottom. And that's, you meet with someone, you
Is
arrange a
that
scene.
is that similar to like dom and sub? All right.
I'll get to that.
Okay. Sorry.
So a top and a bottom is you meet with someone, you arrange a scene, one person who's the bottom says, like, I want to be spanked. You lay out parameters. No, I don't want you to kiss me. And no, I don't want sex. Okay, the scene's going to last from this time to this time. And as soon as that scene is done, you guys return to just your normal life. Think of it as a play date.
Yeah. It almost seems like theater or improv or something.
Yeah. Yeah. The BDSM scenes are very theatrical in many aspects. So one level deeper than that is submissive and dominant. So you see those roles start to disperse a little bit more. So instead of, hey, I'm going to be your sub for an hour, it's going to be, hey, we're in a relationship. You are a service submissive. So you'll bring me coffee in the morning. In exchange, I will make sure that your pills stay, nicely organized. I'm also going to keep on you to seek therapy. I'm going to make sure that, and you're going to work out. You're going to see a therapist. You're going to drink enough water. So it takes on a little bit more of an extended role. But you can easily say, "Hey, I'm done with this," or I can't be in the submissive mind frame right now. And then the most significant level, if that's the right way of saying it, or the most all-encompassing, is master and slave.
What would that encompass?
So there's usually a collaring ceremony where the master will collar the slave. See, this is where it gets into dicey territory because in the court of law, did you give over your free will to someone else? Of course not. The court of law is never going to be like, "Oh, you guys signed a slave contract. Like, okay, never mind. He can beat you, for not having his dinner ready at 5:30." But there's no time limit. So once you're collared, then you're just collared. And you, as the slave, place all of your trust in the master. And he's the one who, he or she guides you in the direction that they feel is most appropriate for you.
Do you notice psychological differences between someone who's drawn to a submissive or someone who's drawn to a dominant role?
Yes. So you have You have submissives who they they're drawn to the submissive nature because they don't want to take responsibility for themselves. And that's the unhealthy portion, So you'll get these submissives that say, oh, when my dominant beats me, that's therapeutic, so I don't need therapy. But if you have issues, you can't rely on the person who you're in a relationship with to also be your therapist. That's unbelievably unethical.
Interesting.
And for a dominant should feel the same sense of responsibility as having a child.
Interesting.
So I have a 10-year-old son. If he acts out in school, yes, part of that is him. He decided instead of going to the teacher, he was going to say mean words to another student or something like that. Part of that is his choice, but I'm still on the line because I'm still his parent and he's a minor. So it's still my responsibility.
Is there much kind of switch over? Do people take on both roles over time, or kind of a sub stays a sub and a dom stays a dom?
You can have different elements of your personality with different people. So if you're polyamorous and you're submissive to, let's say, your main partner, you can be dominant to your secondary partner.
Interesting. What would create that dynamic?
Just different relationships require different, I'm sure that you're different with different friends, versus your parents, versus your siblings, versus, your work colleagues. It's just different parts of your personality respond differently. I'm a different person to my son than I am to my husband.
Interesting. I forgot what I was going to ask. I think a lot of people would be curious about, because it seems like a foreign concept to them, this idea of sadism and masochism, bringing
Mhm.
like either inflicting pain or having pain inflicted on you. Like that would be kind of like a foreign concept to a lot of people. How can you psychologically unpack that?
The way I've unpacked it, and I do believe that there are articles that have hypotheses about the inflicting of pain, but the way I view it is it's similar to working out, because while you're working out, it sucks. No one's like, oh, I love this burn, or maybe they do because they associate the endorphin rush that comes after. So right now it sucks. That's similar to getting caned. Right now it really, really sucks. But I know if I wait until what they would call subspace, where you feel floaty, it's actually, I believe it's shock.
So like the draw is the contrast between this painful state and then like kind of this relief state when the pain ends.
Yeah. And you're being held by your dominant
Mm.
and something called aftercare.
Interesting. When does BDSM go off the rails to the point where you would say that's psychologically unhealthy?
So there's the thing that I already said, the submissive who believes all I need is that partner to complete me, to kind of take over and take away the responsibilities for my actions. But that's similar. That you can see that similar themes of that in controlling and abusive relationships. The willingness to accept a relationship that's not benefiting you more than it's hurting you, and there can be echoes from, my parents treated me this way, so now I accept it and I'm okay with it with a partner because that's what I deserve. That's what everyone's done to me.
I'm curious about your personal politics because you seem like a very heterodox thinker,
Heterodox? Sorry.
just like out of the box thinker.
Yeah. Yeah. Politics, I lean more conservative, but the newer version of conservative.
Gotcha.
I have no issue with gay, lesbian relationships.
I'm wondering, this is just a question of mine. I'm wondering if you get pushback, and if you do you get more pushback from the BDSM community telling them you're conservative, or from conservatives telling them about BDSM?
So I don't tell my clients that I'm conservative because what place does that have in the therapeutic relationship? Like, one or two have gleaned it, especially, I had one client that I'd been with 6, 7 years. So over time, he through kind of repeated interactions with me, he started being like, I wonder if Deirdre's conservative. And when finally, it was to the point where like, yeah, I'm conservative. He's like, I know it.
Did that throw him off at all? Oh, wait. Yeah, it's interesting. What type of relationship problems do BDSM people come to therapy for?
So you have, I'm trying to think. I've had a couple. No, I've had one, the one that I talked about. He was in a significantly more BDSM heavy dynamic with his wife, but she lost, I would say, 90% of her interest. And then he went to pro doms, and one of the pro doms really messed him up mentally,
What does that mean?
like traumatized him.
From like extreme pain or like
No, she very psychological. She had him running her social media website, and she would call him at 2 in the morning and say, "This is wrong. This needs to be deleted. How dare you?" 90%, well, I never met her, but I would say I'm 75% sure that she had BPD characteristics.
so this guy was like somewhat of an employee, but like also
Yeah, he
this was
wasn't
kind
being
of part,
paid.
but it was like
Yeah.
part of the act.
Yes. Yeah.
It's really interesting. How common is that type of thing?
I would say more common than not, because with pro doms,
What is pro dom?
so pro dominance, those are people who do domination of clients for money.
Okay, okay, gotcha.
So you will pay me $200 per hour, and we'll do this session or this scene. And I mean, that's the very cut and dry, pay me $200 per hour. We'll meet for 5 hours. I'll do a caning scene for you. Aftercare will be included. And then when that itch, comes up again, kind of like those gay people who would be in heterosexual relationships, and then they would have to sneak out and see gay guys just to scratch that itch,
Yeah.
and then they go back to their life.
When I think of BDSM, the first thing that comes to mind is like something sexual, but it sounds like there's a lot of times where
There is a
not sexual at
lot of
all.
overlay of sexual components.
But like it seems like a good chunk of it is not sexual at all. Maybe I don't know.
Depends on which subgroup you're talking about.
Gotcha. That's really interesting because it's yeah it's just kind of like a foreign concept to me where um like the two people you were mentioning where like she's yelling at him at 2 in the morning, like that doesn't seem like there's anything sexual about that, but there's like some psychological itch that's being scratched, I guess.
Yes, so she drew him in, and I believe she drew him in. She was drop get dead gorgeous. And with my hypothesis that she had some borderline tendencies, if not the full disorder, that they are very good at drawing people in. They're insanely good at drawing you in and capturing people for relationships. For him, the most traumatizing part was he had agreed to a scene, but she was upset with him, and she did something that it was a hard no for him within the scene in order to humiliate him, to chastise him.
One of the things that I keep wondering about, like the humiliation specifically, people who are drawn to or even aroused by being humiliated. First of all, what's the psychology behind that? And secondly, do you see anything pathological in any way about that?
It depends on the context. If you have a relationship where the two of them are steady, they're rock solid, the relationship is good, they can slip into that scene. And again, that's very, you know, time oriented. So from 7 to 8, I'm going to be saying these things to you. I don't believe them, but I'm going to be saying these things to you. And if this crosses something, or if you feel like your limit's being approached, you say red and the scene shuts down and everyone stops. And then you comfort and you do aftercare versus someone who gets repeatedly humiliated. I believe that's edging more into a fetish. So they can't get their sexual fulfillment any other way.
Do you feel like there's something under the surface there? If somebody like needs to be humiliated in order to have arousal or
Yes,
sexual fulfillment, like
100%.
what's going on there?
I don't know. That's something that if I had a client that they came to me and they said, the only time I can get aroused is when I'm being called all of these monstrous things, I would try to dig into what that's fulfilling for them. So was there past history of sexual abuse for them? Were they belittled by their first relationship? So it was linking that, the belittlement with sex.
Interesting. It's interesting. What are some things that you think are important that the general populace does not know about BDSM?
It's interesting when I see BDSM shown in movies because it's always very contrived. I think the closest movie that I've seen that adequately has shown BDSM in a light that I could actually see it being done is The Secretary. Maggie Gyllenhaal and
Mm.
I forget the lead male role.
How much accuracy was there in 50 Shades of Grey? None. What do you think? I mean, that was like, it was women all over the place being
I
just
know.
going to the theater in droves. Like, what were
Yeah.
people seeking from that movie?
I think that, well, it's like any part of sexual orientation. No one's completely straight. No one's completely gay. There's always gradients. So I think that you had these women who are maybe in stuffy relationships or relationships where they're really not connected to each other. And then you can see this movie where he's drop dead gorgeous. He's independently wealthy. They're always independently wealthy. A common joke in the BDSM scene is, if Christian Grey lived here and it shows a trailer, this would be an episode of CSI.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. It's, I think regardless of what the sex act is, the good looking billionaire is the key part of that equation.
Reason. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't watch 50 Shades just because I was like, no, I've got better stuff to do.
Interesting.
But I think it does fulfill that need for people who may be in relationships that aren't fulfilling those needs. One thing about BDSM relationships is there's incredible amount of disclosure and understanding between the two partners. So my husband knows everything about me and vice versa. Whereas I think in vanilla relationships, it's much easier to have secrets, especially, like my uncle touched me when I was, 7. It's much easier to bury that and say, I'm not talking about that because you're also not exploring those darker urges.
How can, if you're a vanilla person, as you say, and you say, well, I don't look good in leather and like the whole BDSM stuff, like I don't know if I'm into that. Like, how can I get that type of depth in a relationship that you have?
You can have that depth. You can have that depth in a relationship without BDSM. I don't think I haven't seen many relationships like that, but I do believe that you can have that relationship where you guys are authentic and you're able to tap into what the other person is feeling. That's not only a BDSM thing. We just dwell a lot more in it because let's say I'll just continue with my uncle touched me when I was 7. I'll just continue. Like, let's say that's my framework. So that's going to be a mine in the minefield for me. So anytime, my partner starts saying like, oh, you're like a nasty little girl, that's going to shut me down because that's going to touch upon that trauma. So my partner naturally is going to need to find out about, oh yeah, my uncle did that to me when I was 7. And that's where, you need to be seeking therapy for that. I cannot be your therapist. I'm your dom.
Gotcha. That's interesting. Do you think you have like an added advantage being a therapist in this community? Like you like are better going a layer deeper than
Yes.
other people naturally do.
Yes, 100%. Because I'm able to, like you said, you were taught never to question. You were taught never to dig, which I can understand. You don't want to go in guns blazing and saying, well, obviously you had sexual abuse, because why would you be doing this messed up stuff if you didn't have sexual abuse? I understand that, but it's much easier for me to be able to work with my one client, the client that I had for 6 years, and work with him and saying that pro dom, what she did wasn't okay. That was abuse. That was psychological abuse, what she did to you. And no wonder you're having trauma symptoms about this.
Yeah, very interesting. So switching gears a bit, you're a conservative in a very left-wing field. Like how do
Yeah.
you see yourself or conceptualize who you are in this field that's very different from your politics?
I tend to be very research driven in that I'd like research to be backing up my interventions, and I'd like it to be harder research. Does that make sense? More thorough research. I don't
Rigorous.
want this grad student who decided to write a research paper on they them, like themselves, and they're like, this is my PhD dissertation. That does nothing. That's one person's exploration, and I would say navel gazing of themselves. They're too much, they're too wrapped up in themselves to be able to give any information to anyone else. So I would say seeing the outcomes, so let's say the whole focus on self-esteem, for my generation. Oh, that didn't work. Okay. Instead of going harder, why don't we stop and figure out what went wrong and go another route?
Yeah, yeah, that's good. This kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier with the generation participation trophy. That came out of the self-esteem movement, and now you've got a lot of people with just like a lack of resilience, and it seems like the therapy profession keeps finding ways to make that worse.
Yeah, because it's also paying your bills.
Mm.
And I do believe that people go into the therapy field for one of two reasons. Either you genuinely are interested and excited and want to hear people's stories, even if it's vastly different than yours, and even if their politics are vastly different than yours, you want to know what they have to offer. So there's a curiosity in that. Or you want to be the savior and the white knight. And this population of this not having resilience, that feeds directly into you getting ton of clients because you're feeding all of these platitudes, and you're saying they're there in therapeutic terms. They're there. And you're not delving into, okay, what's the denominator? Like all of these interactions that you have that haven't worked out, you're the common factor in this. So what are you doing to help yourself?
Yeah. What do you see? I mean, there's different, areas with race and gender identity. Like, how are you seeing, it seems like a lot of really weak research gets passed a lot. If it's like the right identity category, the standards are just completely different. Do you kind of see that in the therapy field?
What do you mean by that?
So the biggest one I'm looking at is like gender identity or gender transition for minors, which
Yeah.
has very weak evidence, but it gets propped up as though it's kind of the gold standard.
I do believe that is, and thankfully, I do believe that's coming to an end. I think that the UK is further along than us. I believe they're 5 to 10 years further along. There's been the cast review over in the UK. I think that really did a resounding bit of damage to the whole gender gender advocates, and I feel like there's a large component to this rapid onset gender dysphoria in youngsters. I do believe there's an autism component to it. So you have these autistic kiddos that don't feel quite right in their body, and they're maybe not attracted to the stereotypical boy or girl, and they don't feel like dressing the typical feminine or masculine way. I mean, look at Temple Grandin. She's not
Yeah.
exactly dressing in feminine, like
Yeah.
feminine clothes. Every time I see her, she's in a
She's like dressed like a rancher or something. Yeah.
you know, and thankfully she was born and raised before this whole rapid onset gender dysphoria occurred. There probably is an element of those who have been sexually, like preyed upon, so you have that whole shame and guilt in their gender and hatred. But who knows? We're talking about teenagers who aren't exactly known for their steadfastness in their ideas about themselves.
That's a good
Like they're
point.
always trying on new personas and always saying, "No, mom, this is me." And then a couple months later, you remind them of it. Shut up! Like I'm completely different now. They're trying on different, you know, per, like different personas. Just let them be. Let them figure it out. We did it.
My football coach in high school showed us a picture of when he was in high school, and he had kind of a crazy hairstyle. And he's like, as crazy as this was, he's like, I could get a haircut and it's gone. So his point was like tattoos are permanent, so you have to be more careful,
Yeah.
about that's different than a hairstyle. And you look at cutting off breasts or pumping your body full of hormones, things like that. That's not just trying out a new identity for the day. That's making like a permanent change to your body.
Yeah. Well, you have, so if we stick to, several categories. So the first being kiddos that maybe are a bit on the spectrum. They're very binary. So if you tell a kid that has some form of autism that these hormone blockers are completely reversible, full steam ahead. That's all they need to know. They don't need to know any further. They don't need to look into the research and be like, oh, this causes brain swelling. I'm going to have osteoporosis by the time I'm 30. They can't think that way. And they can't view it through that lens, the multifaceted lens.
Have you seen or observed therapists who are basically like not wanting to take on clients who have different politics than them?
Somewhat, but that's more the therapists who are looking for friends. I had this one coworker, and she's since moved on, but I had this one coworker that she was leaving, and I said, "What about Amy?" Because she was seeing her, but I'd seen Amy for couples counseling. And my coworker said, "Well, you don't like Amy." I'm like, "What does that have to do with anything? I'm not hanging out with her. Like I'm giving her therapy and she knows me."
Yeah, I mean, it would be like, someone comes in with a broken arm and you're like, okay, tell me your religion, tell me your politics, tell
Yeah.
me
I
what,
need to know those things
yeah,
first.
what sports team do you like? I need to know if I'm going to fix your
Yeah.
arm or not.
Yeah. I'm sorry I can't see you.
That's just so bizarre.
You like the Eagles.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not
Okay.
that it can't be annoying sometimes, because I have a couple of clients who will go on at length and just be full of vitriol about Republicans or Catholics, and I'm Catholic. And it,
Gotcha.
it is it is a little more than a little irking at those times, because you sit there and you have to just take it. Be like,
Yeah.
yeah, so hard.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I mean, we fed a bunch of people, but yeah, we're the worst thing ever.
Yeah. Yeah. I got two questions left. And the first one is, how do we fix the therapy profession?
Jeez, I would love it if we attempted to incorporate more the rigors of actually being scientific. That would be lovely. I don't know why. For example, and this is something that still mildly irritates me. So they discovered, how old's the DSM?
Was it 2014 when the TR came out? Is that right?
I believe. Yeah, so almost 10 years.
Yeah.
They've known that people with ADHD, they sleep hotter. They sleep 1 to 2 degrees hotter than people without ADHD.
Hmm.
So, and this is, so you have this kiddo who sleeps 1 to 2 degrees hotter. His bed sheets are always soaked through or always damp in the morning. His parents just change out the sheets more often. They just say, "Oh, that's just Billy." He just sleeps hotter. But that right there, that's scientific. And that's such an easy question to ask. You ask the parents of these kiddos, "Hey, do they sleep hot?" And they say, "Yeah." That right there, what's wrong with including that in the DSM? And it was baffling to me why that wasn't included,
That's interesting.
because that's measurable. And it's so easy. It's so easy to measure.
Yeah. Wow. I would imagine there's a lot of that kind of stuff that gets left out. Final question for you. When you look at society more broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
Owning your own history. So I really adore Viktor Frankl and his book, Man's Search for Meaning. I recommend it to clients that I feel would be able to get what it is giving. And the fact that, okay, let's say you had a hard life. Okay, figure out what you can do about it. It's no one else's trauma but yours. So stop placing your trauma on the world and saying you have to solve this.
I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah. Well, Deidre, thank you so
Yeah,
much for
cool.
joining me. This was awesome. Loved our conversation. I learned a
Yeah,
lot of new things today.
no problem. Take care.